So we're going to pick up where we left off last week, looking at references to Jesus that are outside of the Bible, the New Testament. And we're going to start with someone named Thallus. Now, the thing about Thallus is we don't have any of his writings. He wrote, scholars think, probably around the middle of the first century, but we don't actually have his works. But we do have references to his works. And the one we're going to look at today is by Sextus Julius Africanus. And we actually don't have any of his writings either in whole. But what we do have is a lot of quotes that other people would quote Africanus to the point where you can actually go and find his writings, but what they do is they compile all the quotes that come from, the one we're going to look at is from this George Syncellus, and Eusebius quoted him a lot too. So we actually have a lot of his work. We just don't have like his entire book or his manuscripts, but he was quoted so extensively that we have quite a bit of his writings. So he was a second century, or third century rather, chronographer. He was a Christian, and he was one of the first ones to try to like map out a chronology from creation to the present day, kind of like what we have out in the hall there. Yeah. Now, we've talked before about the Septuagint and the timeline that's in there and how it differs from what we usually see, well, what's in our English Bibles. It's a 6,000 year timeline by today's date. So about 4,000 years before Jesus was born was the date of creation. But 2,000 years ago, Josephus, Africanus, all the people who were chronicling time back then, according to the Bible, they would go 5,500 years or so before Christ. And we looked at, when we were talking about the Septuagint, that it seems like the Septuagint actually preserves what was originally in the Hebrew, and that somewhere along the line, our Bibles that come from Masoretic texts from several centuries later, that seems to have a compressed timeline. So Africanus, his chronography dates the incarnation. Now this is, somewhat speculative, but he proposed that the incarnation happened on Nisan 1. That's the month that would have Passover in the middle of 5501 after creation. That's where we get our tradition. 9 months later, after March 25th of 1 BC, is December 25th. That's where our traditional date for Christmas comes from. It comes from Africanus.
Could you you lost me with Nisan 1 and 55.
Okay. AM means Anno Mundi, means from creation. So we have AD, BC, right? And then there's a third one you see once in a while. Jews use this sometimes. It's AM. Yes?
So like if you were a Jew, that's what you would say what year it was.
Yeah.
Because they didn't know the Messiah was being born. They didn't know it was 1 BC.
Yeah.
So they were going from creation. Right?
Yes. So in other words, there were 5,500 years before Jesus was born versus the timelines that we see that are based on the chronology that's in our own Bibles. Those are usually in the 4,000 range. But that's because in Genesis 5 and 11, they have different numbers. They have, for instance, Seth was born 130 years after Adam was created versus in the Septuagint and what Josephus and what Africanus all reference, they say it was 230 years.
Why is there a disparity?
Well, because in my view, we talked about this back when we talked about the Septuagint. I think it has to do with the Masoretic text. That's sort of the odd man out. That's the Hebrew texts that still exist. And so when we translate into English, there's a preference among translators to go to the original language, which in the Old Testament was Hebrew, right? But what's to say that the Hebrew texts haven't been corrupted in some way? So when there's a discrepancy in numbers, and you go back 2,000 years, and you see everybody's using the sort of numbers that are preserved in the Septuagint, that's evidence that the Hebrew used to have those numbers. Josephus said that he was working from Hebrew manuscripts. His spellings of the names differ from what's in the Septuagint, even though he was writing in Greek, like he would transliterate independently. So he wasn't just referencing the Septuagint. He said that the longer timeline, what we would call a 7,500 year timeline, was what was in the Hebrew text. And so the evidence points to that somehow our Hebrew texts were corrupted centuries later. somebody,
So what is the truth?
this. I mean, this is not necessarily perfect, but all of the chronologies from 2,000 years ago or so were, 5,500, give or take 100 years, not 4,000. That's not what we're talking about today. It's just a point of interest. This guy did a chronology. He came up with numbers that are consistent with the Septuagint. And he's also where we get the tradition of December 25th as Christmas. Not to say Jesus was actually born on that day, but that tradition comes from his work.
What happened, I'm sorry, I'm like a fifth grader. What happened on March 25th?
He's saying that's when Jesus was
Oh,
conceived,
he's saying that.
right? And so that's 9 months before he then would have been born. So if in his chronology he proposed that was the conception date, that was sort of speculative, right? Like Jesus, we know, died on Passover. He died in Nisan. So I think that's where he came up with that. But 1 BC, March 25th, add 9 months to that. That's December 25th, 1 BC. A week later, that's January 1st, year 1. That's where we date our calendars from today. Back then, they didn't do that yet. But when that change happened, it was based on his work, which is just kind of neat, right? This is a significant Christian chronicler. His influence carries on to today as far as
Now I'm
when
ready
we
for
celebrate Christmas. But we're using him right now just to record what Thallus wrote. We don't have a quote from Thallus, but we have Africanus referring to him. So what Africanus writes, I'm going to read this section where he refers to Thallus. He writes, "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness. The rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." So what he's saying is Thallus acknowledged that this darkness took place. He attributed it to an eclipse, and I, Africanus, think he was wrong. Okay? But it's interesting that he is acknowledging that this darkness took place. So then he gives the reason why he says that this is wrong. He says, "For the Hebrews celebrate the Passover on the 14th day according to the moon. And the Passion of our Savior falls on the day before the Passover," right? We all know that from the story. So then he goes on to explain, "But an eclipse of the sun takes place only when the moon comes under the sun. And it cannot happen at any other time, but in the interval between the first day of the new moon and the last day of the old. That is, at their junction." So the opposite end of the month, right? It can't happen at the full moon. So when you have a full moon, the sun is on one side of the earth and the moon is at the opposite end. That's why it's all lit up, right? It goes to the moon, bounces to us, right?
Yeah.
For a solar eclipse, it has to be the opposite, where the sun and the moon are on the same side and the moon passes in front. So the moon can't pass in front of the sun if it's a full moon, right?
Did these writers, did they know one another?
No. So
I thought that's
Africanus
amazing. Yeah.
lived over a century later from when Thallus was said over it. But he wrote things, and so he's responding to this writing. He's saying, hey, he's acknowledging that this darkness took place, but he's wrongly attributing it to a solar
also
eclipse.
say that there's a scripture that comes to my mind where Jesus said they were asking about these people doing this and that in his name. And he says, "I have sheep in other fold that you know not of." But if these men were born long before Jesus, apparently there was a contact.
Well, they were born after Jesus. But what's interesting here is that Thallus, if the dating of his works is correct, they think he wrote around the middle of the 1st century.
Oh, okay.
And then Africanus wrote over like 150 years later or something like that. But AD 50, that's probably before the Gospels were even written. So this reference that Thallus is acknowledging that this darkness took place, that's probably from firsthand experience. If he's writing in the middle of the 1st century, he was probably alive in the early 30s when this would have happened. So this would be like today if we were talking about the big blackout that happened 20 years ago. You remember that? Where power was out in August for a few days or something like that?
4 o'clock.
Right. Or you could say September 11th. Like there's a lot of people who lived through that and have memory of it. Now, some people think, a lot of people think, maybe Thallus was sort of dismissing the darkness, like it was just an eclipse. It could also be that he was just wrongly attributing it to some kind of natural means to bring it about, like just like I do with the Star of Bethlehem. I think it was Venus and Jupiter. That's not to say that God wasn't behind it, but without the full quote from Thallus, we don't really know what his motivation was in attributing it to a solar eclipse. But I hear Christians make that proposition today. If you don't really know how eclipses work and you're reading the text and you read that it got dark in the middle of the day, you might think, oh, that must have been an eclipse. But what Africanus is saying is, well, no, it couldn't have been an eclipse, at least as we're familiar, like the kind that involves the moon blocking the sun, because the moon's at the opposite end of the sky at this time. So it could be that something blocked the sun, but it wasn't the moon, right? Does that make sense, Katie?
It does. I have a question. What about the earthquake? I mean, you say they were aware that it was dark, so that was a visual thing. They were aware that it's dark, but they don't say anything about the earthquake.
Well, Africanus is just describing these things, and then he's refuting something that Thallus said about the darkness specifically. We will talk more about the earthquake, but in this quote, all we're getting is Thallus acknowledging the darkness, attributing it wrongly to a solar eclipse. So that's all we have. We don't have his actual quote. We just know from this fragment that he said the darkness happened, and it must have been an eclipse. So,
I mean, he lived.
Yeah, he would have been there to see.
He lived in Samaria.
Yeah.
Thallus did. So this is like an almost eyewitness account.
Yeah, it very well could be an eyewitness account.
You know those Sumerians.
Well, I'm just saying he's only 30 miles away. So.
All right, so the next one is another one where similarly we don't have his actual writings. We have some references to his work and some quotes of his work. Nobody ever draws a picture of this guy either, just like Thallus. So I don't have a picture of Thallus or Phlegon. But Phlegon of Tralles, which is in Turkey, he acknowledges the crucifixion darkness and the earthquakes. And his work that we no longer have extant, we don't have any existing copies of his work, only references and quotes of it, was called Olympiads. And it covered a long period of history ending in about 139 AD. So we could date this writing from probably about 140, about AD 140. That would bring us up to pretty much current times for when his history ends. So he's probably, writing in about the middle of the 2nd century. And this same fragment that we were looking at a moment ago, this is sort of what comes immediately next, is Africanus goes on to reference Phlegon. He says, Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th hour to the 9th, manifestly that one of which we speak. So he's saying Phlegon's talking about this same event, right? And he's also attributing it to an eclipse, yet saying that it happened during the full moon, which can't be. But he's also giving the time frame that this lasted for 3 hours. Now, another thing about solar eclipses, they don't last 3 hours. The darkness, if you have a total eclipse, it only lasts a few minutes. Before the sun comes out, it starts to get light again. The whole kind of process where you might notice any darkness is somewhere in the neighborhood of an hour, hour and a half. You wouldn't get 3 hours of darkness with a solar eclipse anyway. But yet, Phlegon records that this was a 3-hour darkness.
So were people believing him, Phlegon?
Well, this is all we have right now. We just, what Africanus is saying, hey, he acknowledged that this darkness lasted 3 hours, that it happened during a full moon, that it happened during the reign of Tiberius, but he's calling it an eclipse, which we know can't be an eclipse as we are familiar.
Would people at the time have been pretty readily aware that it wasn't an eclipse, even though these guys were telling them, hey, it wasn't an eclipse? Like, they experienced it, right?
I think it just would probably vary from person to person, how well they understood full moon, new moon, lunar eclipse, solar eclipse, and
some people are hearing this and going like, no, they in that time they're reading this and going like, no, I know how an eclipse kind of works already, and
right.
This doesn't really It'd be like
Yeah,
someone
well,
saying-
Africanus certainly does. I mean,
Right.
he lays it out, right? He
Right.
he understands the mechanics of the eclipse. But, somebody else who's more of a layperson as far as the science behind eclipses go, it got dark in the middle of the day, that sounds like a solar eclipse. And so they're kind of making an assumption.
But these people were looking at the sky all the time, right?
Not all of them, right? I mean, it's just,
Well,
I mean,
a lot of them
eclipses
were
are rare.
looking up at the sky,
Well,
right?
Right.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean everybody understands that solar eclipse happens during the new moon and can't happen at a full moon.
Right.
Same way when Jesus was crucified, the earth shook.
That's what we're
everything
talking
went
about.
dark.
That's exactly what we're talking about. So these are references to those events by people outside of the Bible, one of whom probably lived through it. Now this guy, Phlegon, this is close to a century later, but he's still a historian and he's making reference to these
Praise
events. So as we know, I put the references there at the bottom. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that the darkness lasted from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, which would mean like noon to 3 p.m. on our clocks. And that's consistent with what Phlegon wrote here, or what Africanus says that he wrote. We don't have the actual quote here, but we just have a reference to what
But
he
that
wrote.
could also be a special circumstance.
Exactly.
Wait,
Right.
No, that's
That's the
No,
point.
I mean, as opposed to his normal treatise of the moon, opposites and the new moon, or the full moon, you can't have an eclipse
It's
of
almost,
the
it's
full
almost
moon
like
or
happened
anything
in
like that.
perfect contrast to prove that it was
Yeah,
an eclipse.
Right. Now, it could have been an eclipse in that something blocked the sun, but that something couldn't have been the moon, because the moon was at the opposite end of the sky,
That'd be the
being
Lord.
Literally the
fully
opposite-
illuminated.
the
Yeah.
opposite end of the sky. Like you couldn't be more
Could have been
further
the
away
angel
from that
house.
happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then that's what they're
You
all
couldn't
calling
explain
it.
Like volcanic smoke or a forest fire or anything.
Well, or some people propose a sandstorm. There's something coming up that might cast doubt on that too. But yeah, something other than the moon was blocking the
3
sunlight.
hours of sand.
Next, we have more on Phlegon, but this time being referenced by Origen of Alexandria. This is going to be from something he wrote called Against Celsus from about the middle of the 200s. And we'll get to Celsus a little later, but here we're focusing on Phlegon. And he writes, now Phlegon, in his 13th or 14th book of his Chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus a knowledge of future events, although falling into confusion about some things which refer to Peter as if they referred to Jesus, but also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. So a couple of things here. Origen is making this reference from memory because he says in his 13th or 14th book, he's not quite sure which book it is. So, and he's not quoting directly, but this is something that he's read and now he's talking about. So this isn't a direct quote, but he's describing what he remembers reading. So you might think, well, then maybe he's not that accurate. But it's interesting that he's pointing out the inaccuracy in what Phlegon wrote. So Phlegon was attributing foreknowledge to Jesus, but he's saying, well, he was a little mixed up because some of these things Jesus was actually talking about Peter, not himself. But Phlegon did acknowledge that these things that Jesus predicted came to pass. So maybe this is about, we read in John, where Jesus predicted the manner in which Peter would be killed, that he was going to have his arms stretched out. This could be a reference to that. We don't really know, but something that Jesus predicted about Peter in the future, he got a little mixed up and thought it was Jesus. But he did acknowledge that Jesus was telling of future events that did get fulfilled. And the fact that Origen here is kind of correcting the error gives you some confidence in that he's remembering well what he read, even though he can't remember exactly which of the two books it came from.
So he was calling Phlegon out, right? Sort of.
Sort of.
Fake news?
He's saying what Phlegon got right and what he got wrong. So Phlegon was acknowledging that Jesus had prophetic ability. And then he's just correcting some of the details that Phlegon got wrong. But there's still somebody, this Phlegon, writing and acknowledging that Jesus had these prophetic abilities. Yes?
Remind me about Phlegon. Was he a Christian or was he just a historian?
No, he was a historian.
Okay, thank you.
And then a little bit later in the same work, Origen mentions, he says, and with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which took place, Phlegon too, I think, has written in the 13th or 14th book of his Chronicles. So he's again saying that in the earlier passage, he was referring to Jesus and his prophetic abilities, and he's saying somewhere in there too, he referred to this eclipse and the earthquakes, right? There's the reference from Matthew 27 about the earthquakes that accompanied the darkness during the crucifixion. And then finally, we have from Eusebius an actual quote from Phlegon, and this is in Chronicle, book 2 of Chronicle, which is another lost work, but we have this section of it quoted by Jerome. So we have at least this quote from Phlegon that Eusebius quoted, is preserved in Jerome's writings, which is, and this happens a lot when you're talking about historical writings from 2,000 years ago. A lot of them are gone. Yet we have, in contrast, the Bible, we have all these manuscripts and it's very well preserved. That's not usually the case with these historical writings. And a lot of them that are preserved, we see are preserved because of Christians like Eusebius, who were diligent historians and would quote these things extensively. So a lot of the works of the earlier historians, what we have left of them are from these quotes from later works that we still have. So this quote from Phlegon, in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was a great eclipse of the sun, greater than any had ever been known before. This would be like, because it lasted 3 hours instead of 5 minutes. For at the 6th hour, the day was changed into night, and the stars were seen in the heavens. And so that kind of...
That's at noon.
Right. And according to this, the stars were visible, which means it wasn't a cloud of dust or ash or anything. If this is accurate, right? He's saying that it was clear enough to see stars. And then he says, an earthquake occurred in Bithynia and overthrew a great part of the city of what we would say Nicaea. This is, if you heard of like the Council of Nicaea, this is in Turkey. So the whole region was affected by these earthquakes and the darkness.
They're
How
affected
far away
today
was
too.
that from? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I say the earthquakes in Turkey they just had
A few hundred miles.
Northern Turkey, they have 300 miles long. That tore things up.
So if righteous Jews were being taken by Jesus to heaven, like they were in Jerusalem, wouldn't there be an earthquake and they'd be resurrecting in Bithynia too?
Maybe.
Sure there was.
Or the earthquake was just significant enough that, it was
They
all over the
rose out
place.
of the graves.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a big
But,
deal.
but
I mean, tell your teens and 20-year-olds, sorry, you're wrong, it happened.
the part about this quote that I got really excited about was in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad. So that actually gives us the year, at least with this old style of dating. Now, kind of the mainstream view is that counts from 776 BC, would be like year 1 of the first Olympiad, beginning in the summer. But there's some evidence that might be a year off, that maybe it should count from 775.
I don't understand what an
Olympiad is a 4-year period of time, and that's, back then they didn't have our calendar, right? So anytime there's a date given, you have to use their dating methods and try to sync it up with our Julian calendar that we've kind of projected into the past. So what year was Jesus crucified? According to this quote, it was the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad. What year was that? If you take the mainstream view that year 1 began in the summer of 776 BC, that gets you to AD 33. If it's a year off, then that would be 34 AD.
That's
So-
fantastic.
When we were talking about Herod and Josephus back in January, I was running into some problems with these references to Olympiads where sometimes they seemed like they didn't quite fit. And I remember, Lou, do you remember me asking you? I said,
That's right.
how confident are we in this 776 number? Because I was finding that it would seem to fit better if we use 775. And I've since found other people think that too. But with anything with history, like we talked about how it's sort of dogmatically stated that Herod died in 4 BC. Once history is written down and it gets repeated, if there's a correction to be made, it's really hard to get it corrected because it's out there. And every time somebody brings up a date and they cite somebody else who wrote something earlier, you got to chase them down and say, well, here's why I think that's wrong. And you have all these calculations and it's messy. So any of these times when we're looking at dates, I put C's in front of the dates a lot because there's always a chance that it could be off a little bit. But in this case, I think it's really interesting. I think it's probably going to be one of these 2 years. And so sometimes you'll hear 30 AD proposed as the year Jesus was crucified. And that's sort of based on the idea that he was born before 4 BC.
Yeah.
And this doesn't really line up with that. This seems like there is a traditional dating of 33. And, I think 34 is a viable candidate too. But it's just neat to have such an early reference that at least is attempting to tell you the actual year that this happened. And then it's just a matter of trying to figure out what did they mean when they said the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, how does that line up with our calendar? So it seems to be one of these 2 years.
Interesting because the Olympics is every 4 years, right?
It is, but our modern Olympics haven't continued unbroken. So we try to emulate that. That's where
Right. So
That's
we'd be
where
in
emulating
we'd be in the 3rd year of the 32nd Olympiad.
based on our current Olympics.
Right.
Yeah.
'Cause the Olympics were in
I don't remember when they
Well,
started, but the modern
summer
Olympics.
and
1896.
winter.
Yeah.
But they're modeled after the old Olympic Games,
Yeah.
which happened every 4 years. Yeah. Okay. So earlier, briefly, I mentioned Celsus because Origen wrote a work called Against Celsus. And so now we're going to talk about who was this Celsus character that Origen wrote against. He lived in the 2nd century, and his writings we don't have anymore, but what we have of them, his writing was called The True Word, and Origen, several decades later, wrote an extensive refutation of this writing. And so what we have of the original writing, we have through the quotes from Origen. So Origen's writing basically saying, here's what this guy says, and here's why he's wrong. And in telling us what he said, we have these quotes.
Wouldn't it be like today,
Oops, that shouldn't be up there yet.
computers and everything, you say something and it's out there. It ain't gonna wait for years to find out what
Yeah, I mean,
right or wrong, it's there.
yeah, this is, you can see several decades later
Yeah.
that Origen is writing this. And I've got these animations backwards on this next
So
part.
Origen called out Phlegon, sort of,
Well, he mentioned him, right?
Yeah.
But
and he also did the same thing to Celsus.
well, Celsus was
Celsus.
the focus of his writing. Earlier, we saw some things he wrote about Phlegon in his response to Celsus, but the whole work was called Contra Celsium, or Against Celsus. So, like, the title of the book is Celsus is wrong, and here's why. So here's the quote that we're going to look at from Celsus. So this is recorded by Origen, but this is Celsus's words. He says that Jesus was born in a certain Jewish village of a poor woman of the country who gained her subsistence by spinning and who was turned out of doors, that means kicked to the curb, kicked out, by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery,
Oh, boy.
and she bore a child to a certain soldier named Panthera.
Oh, my.
Oh.
Now, I had that in brackets because there's sort of 2 quotes. That part about the soldier named Panthera wasn't in chapter 28, but he partially quotes this again and has it in chapter 32. And so I kind of pulled that portion up ahead so it can be all be together here.
Wow.
And so if you're looking at just the tone of this, Celsus is putting a negative spin on everything, right? Oh, this poor Jewish woman, and then also there's these accusations of adultery and all that stuff, which we read about in the Gospels too, where the claim that Jesus was born of a virgin wasn't readily accepted by his enemies, right? I mean,
Right.
they would say, isn't he the carpenter's son? Or,
Well, in the movie, did anybody here ever seen Nativity?
yeah, we watch that every year. I love it.
Well, when Mary comes in
Yeah.
from Elizabeth's house, or
Right.
place, and she's very pregnant, and all the women are going.
Yeah. Which, of course they would, right?
Don't look back.
Right.
Oh, don't worry, it was a miracle, right? Like, nobody.
Well, no, and then Joseph, you gotta put her away.
Yeah. So reading on here, that after being driven away by her husband and wandering about for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child, who, having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, so there's a little bit of truth there in that he went to Egypt for a time, right? And having there acquired some miraculous powers on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves. So this is interesting because he's saying, yeah, Jesus did miracles. It's just that he was doing magic that he learned in Egypt. But he's conceding that Jesus did miraculous things. That's what we call a hostile witness. When somebody who's opposed to your position is making the case that you support. And then he returned to his own country highly elated on account of them and his powers, and by means of these proclaimed himself a god.
Wow.
Is that
You know,
a capital G?
I know this
Well-
is the weirdest thing ever.
What's
when
that?
Gina and I went to the state fair,
Yeah,
and these people had this booth here
I mean, they had a ton of.
where they said that
free material.
Jesus got some of his powers when he visited the Great Pyramid when he was a child. And now I'm hearing this.
yeah.
Isn't that weird? And
Yeah.
they actually believed it. I mean, this guy was like,
No, that's what the bad guys said.
Remember I
They're
told you
explaining
about them?
away. Yeah, yeah.
And
We spent most of our time.
They're called the
talking
Oakland
to them
County
that Jesus
Bible
did
Society.
declare himself
Okay,
God.
really?
Lou, how long were you at that booth? I would have loved to have witnessed that.
Well, Gina was there
Right.
for 30 minutes.
That's- So-
and I was there for 20. I'm like, I'm hungry.
Right.
But anyway,
Yeah,
it was
so
just weird.
so Gina,
Go get 'em.
you're right. This is evidence that Jesus did claim himself to be God, which we can
That's
see.
another witness.
Right, we can see that when we read the Gospels, but you get people who say, oh, the Gospels were changed, or that idea came from Paul, or that idea came later.
Yeah.
Jesus was just a good teacher. He was just a wise man. He
Yeah.
didn't claim to be
Good
God. Well,
prophet.
people 2,000 years ago
They were
recognized that
trying
he
to
did. Right.
I don't know, and the last few words of that quote, it says proclaimed himself a God. I mean, that's what.
That's what Celsus, how he puts it.
Okay, Jesus said, well,
He is God.
Jesus.
But a lot of people
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
See,
Right,
I
well,
read that,
So
that
he just-
This is
he was
distorted.
not into
proclaiming
Any,
himself.
Yeah.
any of the other.
Yeah. Just like everything else, there's a little bit of distortion and misrepresentation here, but you can see there's threads of truth in there, right? Like
Yeah, oh, yeah.
he was born of kind of a poor woman, right? And so, right? But
Circumstances were
So
such
how
where people.
many
Yeah.
women back then were rich?
yeah, I mean, he's sort of saying that, like, how there's people who just look down their nose at someone who's not of a noble class, right? Like,
But we found that, I think the most successful argument with them was this. Lou really got into this. The spirit of Antichrist that wants to deny that Jesus is God, and we were able to, you could see they got to thinking. It's like, do you understand?
And it's gonna be
Remember
really
when
good
somebody
movies.
come up to Jesus and said, good master, he says, there's none good but God.
Right.
That really took me. I thought,
Yeah.
he's referring to the Father. He's not even taking himself.
well, he would say, "Why do you call me good?"
Yeah.
Right?
I thought, wow.
On the one hand, he did deserve to be called good
Oh, I
because he
know.
was good, but he's sort of calling attention to that. He also would speak of his own authority. He didn't say, "Thus says the Lord." He said, "I say unto you." He spoke of his own authority when he
Well,
would
when they
speak the truth.
speak, oh, they're a good person. That is when they was
Yeah.
preaching this morning. I thought, oh, really?
right.
So
And
something
I got a lot of work to do.
they got into was like a life for a life, and they were saying that he was good, and I'm like, well, there's a lot of good people that have died for other people. I mean, you look at the guy who went down in the plane, keeping it from hitting into the pond. He was good. He said, "Let's roll," but his death didn't save mankind,
Right.
Only God could come to earth, and only His sacrifice,
because he
His
was
blood
perfect,
could redeem us.
and because he was God the Son, he
Thank
was
God.
his worth was not that of a mere person. His blood was of infinite value,
Amen.
or is.
And-
Wow.
You might wonder, what is this business about a soldier named Panthera? And there's sort of the theory behind that is that name, which was a name back then, that it's similar to the Greek word for virgin, which is Parthenos. And see, if you like switch the N and the R, they're almost the same. So this would, I think, if we were speaking in English and somebody's mocking the virgin birth, you might say he was born of some guy named Virgil, right? It's a similar name to the word virgin. There's nothing actually, historical about that. It's just, this is just some.
I think it's interesting, Parthenos, and then we have Parthenon.
Yeah, that's probably where that word comes from. I think that means of the virgin.
Yeah, of the Virgin Athena.
Yeah, that's the genitive form of
that's
this
right,
word.
that's right.
Panthera means what? Large cat.
Yeah, like
Large
panther.
Large cat.
That's lions and tigers, panthers. Yeah. So this is Mara bar Serapion.
Serapion.
He's a philosopher. And he writes in a letter, we don't really know exactly when this was written. It might have been as early as AD 70. It might have been 200, but it was in the early century or two. So he writes in a letter in prison to his son, he says, what advantage did the Athenians gain from murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as a punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato. Neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law he laid down.
Wow.
So, again, we don't know exactly when this was written. It must have been written after 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. When were the Jews finally dispersed? Was it around that time or a little bit later?
Dispersed?
Like,
130s.
yeah, so it's probably, it could be after that too, if you're talking about them being totally dispersed. But certainly, this is an acknowledgement that Jesus existed, that after he was killed, not long after that, you had the Jews basically expelled from Jerusalem, and that he was proclaiming a quote, a new law, right?
Wow.
So that's quite a bit. For people, again, who say that he never existed, he was well known here probably in the 2nd century by this philosopher, not only about how he was killed, but about what happened in the aftermath in the decades that followed thereafter.